Hey everyone, welcome to this Wednesday afternoon edition of the RotoPros pre-lock show. 7-game early slate with a lot of wind and a lot of warm hitting weather to worry about. So we have a little bit of a difference in what we're doing today because Greg is more concerned with FanDuel, I guess, today. So we're going to talk about FanDuel and Draftkings. I guess that's in our title, so we probably should do that more all the time anyway. But Greg, to start with, why do you see a difference between the two sites for the early slate?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things for me. First off, I generally don't really like to play slates where we don't have lineups prior to lock, and I don't think we're going to have lineups for the Padres-Giants game prior to the start of the slate. The other thing, too, is there's a lot of good options on the slate, and FanDuel just narrows it down because the Cubs-Rockies game and the Giants-Padres game isn't on the slate. So I think there are enough good pitching options on the 5 games we've got Royals, Red Sox, Indians, Rangers, Tigers, Rays, Twins, Blue Jays, and Cardinals, White Sox. I think there's enough options in those games that I'd prefer just to focus on those ones than adding more viable options to choose from.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The other problem with FanDuel generally, though, is that you have to narrow it down to one pitcher, and you can only stack 4 hitters per team. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Less games, it's definitely a big deal, and not having to worry about this Wrigley game definitely makes it easier. So I guess we won't talk too much about which side is better. I think you can play both. I think they're both worth doing today. I'm going to be on Draftkings just because, I don't know, I'm more comfortable with Draftkings. I like having 2 pitchers, and there are more pitchers that I have interest in. I mean, on FanDuel, some of the ones that are worth considering are just too expensive, and we'll kind of get to that. But I think both sites are viable, so we'll kind of just talk about both of them. So where do you want to start here if we're looking at pricing for both Draftkings and FanDuel?
All right, so starting with FanDuel, the top-end pitchers are a little less expensive. So the only 2 pitchers I'm rostering on FanDuel are Corey Kluber and Carlos Martinez. My preference is Martinez just because, I mean, he's so cheap at $9,500 that you could kind of use him with any hitters that you want. So I like Martinez as my primary pitching option. If I have lineups where I have really cheap hitters for my stacks, then I go up to Kluber. But overall, my preference on FanDuel is Carlos Martinez. So I know you feel that both Kluber and Martinez are a little bit too expensive on DraftKings. So do you have no interest in rostering either of them?
No, I've actually I was looking at Kluber a bit this morning. I've kind of changed my thought process here. I'd been concerned about Kluber's start to the year with lower strikeout rate, lower swinging strike rate, lower velocity, but in his most recent start against the Mariners, all of those things were back up. Kluber was throwing just as hard as he had been last year. To start this season in April, he had been 91 to 92. And then for his last start, he was back up to 93, 94 like he was last season. So I no longer have any concerns about Kluber being less good than he was last season. And he's in a really easy matchup against Texas at home. One concern is the wind and how warm it is there. The ball could carry a lot. But Kluber gets so many strikeouts that the ball isn't really put in the air enough where it really affects him all that much. And I do think there's a lot of cheap hitting on DraftKings. It's probably the same on FanDuel too, because we have some quirky lineups where you can fit Kluber and stack some of the better spots and still make the lineups work because a lot of the good hitters are just underpriced.
Yeah, the other thing too about like heat and wind concerns, that's the situation for almost every single game this afternoon.
Yeah, it is. The over-under, so just to support that, the over-under has gone up for literally every single game on the early slate, except for the game in Minnesota, which doesn't have the heat and wind concern, and then also the Wrigley game because the over-under just priced it in. The Wrigley game over-unders don't come out until the morning of because the wind is so important, and Vegas just waits to see what the conditions are going to be before making the opening line. But the over-under has gone up basically a full run in all of the other games. So yeah, the weather is definitely boosting offense everywhere today.
All right. So in terms of the cheaper pitchers, so does that also mean you don't like Martinez then?
Yeah, Carlos Martinez, I just don't think is nearly as good as Kluber. So if I'm making a choice there on the high end, Kluber is just so much better. Martinez could be more popular too because Kluber's a little tougher to pay up for on DraftKings. And Martinez, his xFIP and FIP are just so much worse than what his ERA is. He's walking 4 guys per 9 innings. I think there's more downside for him than for Kluber. And if he's going to be a little bit more popular, then it definitely makes a lot of sense to fade him. But even if he's not more popular, here Martinez numbers for the year: 9.5 Ks per 9, 4 walks per 9. He's kind of just, I think he's a number 2 in the rotation starter with a lot of volatility. So there's certainly upside at home against the White Sox, but I just think Kluber is so much better of a play that I won't be using Martinez. It makes sense on FanDuel. You're getting more of a discount, but on DraftKings, you're not getting that kind of discount.
Okay, so should we talk about the pitcher we disagree about now?
Yeah, sure. I guess we're going to have to do it at some point.
Okay, so a pitcher who I really like for his price on DraftKings is Yu Darvish. So there is win concern at Wrigley Field, except it's such an easy matchup against the Rockies, who are last in baseball in WRC plus against right-handed pitching. They have a 54 WRC plus. They have a 23.7% strikeout rate, so they strike out a lot. They don't hit well. So here are the two concerns. The wind. The ball is blowing out at Wrigley today. That's going to help offenses. The wind is blowing out, and there's heat in almost all of the games today, though. The other issue is that Darvish has not pitched as well this year as he did last year. But still, last year he averaged almost 20 DraftKings fantasy points per game. He needs about 16.5 to hit value today. I think that he's probably more likely to get the win bonus than isn't going to get the win bonus. So to me, his drop-off from this year to last year, I do think that there's a chance that he rebounds from it because it's only been 5 starts. But I think that it's offset by the dip in price and just how easy the matchup is against the Rockies, because the Rockies are probably the easiest matchup possible for a right-handed pitcher.
So I think you're missing a couple things here. Darvish has a much lower swinging strike rate this year, and his walk rate is way up. So even his current peripherals of about 10 Ks per 9 and 4.5 walks per 9, I think that actually oversells how he's pitched this year. He's been worse than that. I think it's been a little fluky that he's gotten this many strikeouts without getting the whiffs. He might start pitching better, but he clearly has not been very good. But the other thing about the Rockies as a matchup, Colorado had an 87 WRC plus overall last year. And the reason it's so much lower this year in part is because Charlie Blackmon missed, I think it was 3 games. Arenado missed 5 games. Carlos Gonzalez has missed games. They've been playing a lot without their better players. So the early season stats, I wouldn't put too much weight there. Like the Rockies are a bottom 10 offense, maybe a bottom 5 offense, but the current numbers have them as the worst offense in baseball, and I just don't think that's true.
Well, last year they were worst against. They were last in WRC plus against righties also.
Yeah, they were last against righties. They were 87 overall. What was the exact number versus righties? In the 70s or so?
84, which was tied for last with the Giants. So I would still consider it a very easy matchup.
Yeah, I think it's an easy matchup. It's not just like the best possible matchup or anything. And there's downside because they do have power and the weather conditions. Like how much of a percentage boost? Well, if the weather is boosting over-unders generally when it's this windy by 3 or 4 runs, like we're talking about a 40 or 50% increase in expected output, then going for, like, I think it's kind of just logical to bump an 80 WRC plus to 100 or 110 or so. Like, do you see a flaw in doing that?
So if let's see, what's the implied run total for the Rockies in this game?
Let's see. It's roughly 4.5.
Okay. So with neutral wind,
I think it would be around 3.25 runs. Like
so
if there was no wind in this game, then Darvish would be by far my favorite pitcher on the slate. But the wind is so relevant here.
So if we're saying that Darvish is going to give up 1.5 more runs, and all those runs wouldn't be him anyway, then we would still say that whatever his baseline is, we're giving him basically a 3-point downgrade to his baseline.
I guess, but it's more it's more hits, then it becomes fewer innings because he's given up more runs. So it's taken him longer to get the outs because he's put more runners on base and more runners at the plate, I guess, because they're hitting home runs. So maybe a 5-point downgrade. If that's the case, though, like I don't think Darvish is a bad play. I think he's just kind of a mediocre play. And he's probably like my 4th or 5th favorite pitcher. But yeah, I guess I just don't think he's like the strongest option. I don't think he's a terrible play, though. I don't want to make it seem like that's where I stand.
Okay, so for his price, he's my 2nd favorite pitching option on DraftKings, and my favorite is probably Michael Fulmer at 7,200. It's just a cheap price for Fulmer, who is not like an elite starting pitcher by any means, except he works very deep into games generally. The Tigers usually let him throw a lot of pitches. Last year, I think he averaged over 7 innings per start when he was healthy for the first half of the year. So to me, it's 7,200 for Michael Fulmer and a plus matchup against the Rays. I think that there's a really high floor and there's a higher ceiling than most people realize because he offsets the lack of strikeouts by working deeper into games and getting extra innings. So I really like Fulmer at 7,200.
Yeah, Fulmer is probably my favorite pitcher for his price, although I think I'll actually roster Corey Kluber more because I'd initially been making some Snell Fulmer lineups, but I think it's just, or I guess it could be Fulmer Darvish lineups, but I think there's just a little bit too much money on the table where you're not getting the best value per dollar by using 2 cheap pitchers on DraftKings because there's a lot of cheap value on offense. Some of these teams are really, really underpriced. So I may actually be close to all in on Kluber with Fulmer as the primary 2nd option, mixing in Snell number 3, and then possibly Darvish number 4. I won't have any Carlos Martinez on DraftKings. So do you think that makes sense? Because, well, I don't know how much you've looked at hitter pricing for DraftKings for today, but it looks like a lot of guys are cheap enough where you can just pay up for Kluber mostly as the primary option. And then Fulmer makes the most sense as a cheap guy.
Yeah, there's definitely, and there's some of the guys that are cheap on DraftKings are also cheap on FanDuel. Brandon Guy or Rajay Davis. There's some really cheap hitters for the Indians in a favorable matchup against Matt Moore, who's not very good. So that does make it easier to spend up for some pitching. For me, I think for their prices, my favorite options are Darvish and Fulmer on DraftKings. I also think that Blake Snell is in play at 9,800. I don't really love the price on him, except he's been so good this year that I think he's worth rostering.
Yeah, Blake Snell is really, really good. So there's a little bit of a concern here with the wind for Snell. So the wind is blowing across the field from right to left. So that means that the fly balls to right field are probably going to get held up a bit, but the fly balls to left field are going to carry more towards the foul pole and could have more home run potential. So for a left-handed pitcher against righties, that's more of a concern. For Fulmer as a right-handed pitcher against lefties, that's less of a concern. So I think the wind favors the Tigers side of the game a little bit, but that's a very mild point here. I'm not basing the decision too much on that. The real bottom line is that Fulmer is just way too cheap. I think Snell's price is just a little bit too cheap for how good he's been. Snell also is probably going to have like no ownership because he kind of just is in no man's land between the expensive pitchers and the cheap ones. But I do like both guys. I'm a little concerned about how warm it is, but that's the case in every game. So we can't worry too much about that. Do you want to talk about Marcus Stroman at all, or Fernando Romero, or like I think I'm kind of just fading that game completely. I think both pitchers are just okay ground ball pitchers, and there's no favorable hitting conditions. So is that game a fade for you too?
Yeah. So I mean, the biggest issue with this game is that I think that there are better pitching options. I think there are better offensive options. And even though I think that you could say there's upside in Stroman for his price because it's just really cheap for him, and I think that he gets undersold a little bit in his stats just because his matchups have been so difficult this year. He's pitched in Cleveland. He's pitched against the Yankees twice. He's pitched in Texas. But you don't need to save that much salary. And I still think that guys like Darvish or Fulmer are better options than him. So I don't really like the offenses or the pitchers for that game.
Yeah, just to touch on Romero quickly, this is his first career start. He kind of profiles as a ground ball pitcher who doesn't strike a lot of guys out. Maybe a similar pitcher to like Kyle Gibson. So that's not someone who has a ton of upside, although Gibson did score 30-plus fantasy points against the Yankees. But we're not expecting Romero to be that good of a DFS pitcher. I think he's an okay real-life pitcher, so that probably just makes the game worth entirely fading.
All right, so let's get into the offenses then. There's a bunch of offenses that are in really good spots. Some because of the hitting conditions that we've talked about. There's also some really shitty pitchers. So to me, I think the offenses with the highest expected output are the Cubs, the Cardinals, the Indians, and the Red Sox. And then it's just kind of trying to figure out how we go about rostering. Now, I think for their price tags, the Indians are the best play on both FanDuel and Draftkings. Do you agree with that?
I think it's the Cubs. The Cubs are so cheap. I mean, the Indians are kind of close, but I think the expected output for the Cubs is higher, largely because the way that the Cubs are going to score runs today is more likely to be via the homer. So Tyler Anderson is getting about 25% grounders this year, and it's a game where the wind is blowing out to center field as much as 25 to 30 miles per hour, and it's really warm. Like, it's the perfect conditions for fly balls to carry, and Tyler Anderson just puts balls in the air. The wind also just matters more at Wrigley Field than it does anywhere else because of how old the stadium is, and it's not really built to contain the wind effects. So the Cubs are the team that I think has the most fantasy point output, even though I do think the Indians could score more total runs than them. In terms of pricing, it's pretty close, I think. But the Cubs are also easier to stack position-wise. I guess
the Indians are cheaper.
Oh, wow. Okay. Rajai Davis is leading off. Yeah. Okay. 1 through 5, they're definitely cheaper. One of the issues is that Encarnacion and Yonder Alonso play the same position. But yeah, the Indians are cheaper. Their offense is a little bit worse today too, though, without Jose Ramirez in there. That's a little bit of a knock on them. But I think some of these top offenses, it's pretty close between all of them. So I kind of want to spread it around. The Cubs should have more ownership than everyone, though. Is that part of the reason you would prefer Cleveland, or is it just the pricing value?
No, it's part of the pricing value. I mean, for me also, playing on FanDuel, the Cubs aren't on the slate. But I think the Cubs are a really good spot also. I think it's a good spot for the Cardinals, who I think are going to have the least ownership of any of those 4 offenses. And the Red Sox are just ridiculously expensive. So in terms of the priority of how I would want to roster them, it would be Indians 1, Cubs 2, Cardinals 3, and then Red Sox 4. And I wouldn't stack any other offense.
Yeah, for me, it's going to be Cubs 1 because the home run potential for everybody. I think you don't quite need the savings to go that cheap. Like, I think I'm going to be plugging the Indians more than any other team. I think Rajai Davis makes more sense as a plug. It's a little bit of a tougher stack with Encarnacion and Alonso both being first baseman. And the Indians' offense at the bottom of the order isn't great either with Roberto Perez and Eric Gonzalez. So I'm kind of just going to be mixing and matching some of the Indians guys. I think the Cubs are the best value. I guess the Cubs are just going to be the team I end up using the most because of the home runs, the way they're going to score runs. And I think the pricing is close enough where it's fine to do that. The Indians certainly have some good value plays. Yeah, the Red Sox, I think, are a sneaky bet to score the most runs today. I mean, it is the game with one of the highest over-unders. But because of the pricing, I think their ownership actually could be lower than the Cardinals. Do you think that's possible? Or is just the Cardinals, it just doesn't seem like as enticing of a matchup? Because I think people still view Danny Duffy as a good pitcher, and he's probably below average.
Let's see. If I put in, I mean, the Red Sox are really expensive, so I do think it makes them just harder to use in general, which I do think the Cubs are going to be the highest owned offense.
Yeah, I do too.
So maybe I think the Cubs might have enough ownership that there isn't really significant consideration to any other team. To me, I guess the big issue with the Red Sox is just the pricing makes them hard to use in a lot of lineups. So that's why they're my 4th favorite offense.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I'm just kind of looking positionally at the Cubs and Indians, like who fits with who. Addison Russell is down to 7th in the order, so that's going to have me higher on Francisco Lindor. But Jason Kipnis is a good value play. It's just kind of hard to justify not using Javier Baez, who has ridiculous numbers against lefties, especially hitting homers, and he's facing a left-handed pitcher who's fly ball prone in a game where the ball's just going to be, I mean, every fly ball could have a chance to be a homer. So it's just hard to rationalize not using Baez in nearly every lineup. He is a little more expensive than a lot of these guys, but I think Baez and Almora are going to be my 2 highest owned hitters today. And Lindor should make a lot of lineups as well.
Yeah, I think I think Baez is still a little bit pricey at 4,400, but it's fine with him. With stacks and with the wind blowing out. I probably wouldn't use him outside of stacks though.
I mean, he has been a lot better this year, and he was a huge prospect. He hasn't been that good of a hitter throughout his career, but he has been really good against lefties. So just going to.
But also this year, as he's been better against righties and worse against lefties.
But he has been good against everybody.
He has a -2 WRC plus against lefties this year.
All right, let's find the sample size here. Okay, yeah, I was not aware of that.
It's very small, but
yeah,
I mean his overall sample size for the entire season is small.
Right, he's 3 for 28 against lefties this year. His strikeout and walk rates are better against lefties. It's 28 at bats. Anything can happen in 28 at bats. Yeah, this is a very strong reverse split that Baez has going so far, but yeah, I think that'll kind of balance out. Either way, he has a lot of power, and it's a game where the ball should carry. But Jason Kipnis is a good play too, so they're both worth having a lot of. I also think the Rockies are worth stacking because no one's going to have them, but no one's going to have a lot of these teams. So you had mentioned the Royals yesterday as a possible contrarian team. Who do you think is the better upside play as a contrarian pick, the Royals or the Rockies?
I still think the Cardinals.
Yeah, I guess that's not the question, but yeah, the Cardinals may have similar ownership to those two teams because there's going to be so much of a focus on other spots. Yeah, the issue. I also
think the Cardinals, as a popular team yesterday that didn't have a great game, I think that sometimes could drive people away from them, and also just the Cubs, the Indians, and the Red Sox existing. So I think the Cardinals are still a viable contrarian option that I would prefer over the Royals or the Rockies.
Yeah, that's the problem I'm running into too when thinking about the Rockies or the Royals. Contrarian team is other teams that are in better situations are going to be more contrarian, but I still think Carlos Gonzalez is a good value play. What is his FanDuel price? Is Gonzalez cheap there too? Because I think he was priced down because he was hurt for a while.
The game's not on the slate.
Okay, Gonzalez does not have a FanDuel price.
Yeah, it's not on the slate. The Cubs Rockies game.
All right, yeah, and I think the Royals side of the game on FanDuel, possibly Chesler, Cuthbert. Sal Perez is going to be a lot lower owned than Wilson Contreras for sure. So maybe that's a decent catcher pivot. The other thing about Matt Moore, just kind of looking at the Indians, Moore is a reverse splits pitcher as a lefty. So, I don't think Kipnis, Brantley, and Alonso will have that much ownership. Edwin Encarnacion's been pretty bad this year. How much more ownership do you think he'll have than Yonder Alonso?
I would say a decent amount more, especially because I think when a lot of people stack, they just will check off the top 5 hitters in the lineup. So I think Alonso hitting 6th and Encarnacion hitting 5th also makes a difference. So I think Encarnacion will have a lot more ownership than Alonso will.
Yeah, in the game that the Indians faced Jake Odorizzi, where we stacked them a couple of weeks ago, Alonso was 1% owned. I think he always has very low ownership because Encarnacion is on his team, but Alonso might be a better hitter right now. Update from Nick, the Rockies lineup is out. We don't have Carlos Gonzalez in the lineup. Yeah, this Rockies lineup is not very appealing with David Dahl batting second at 4,000 on DraftKings. Trevor Story against a righty, I don't have much interest. Gerardo Parra is probably the only good value play then. Yeah, so the Rockies are mostly a fade even in those favorable conditions, although I do think it makes sense to throw in maybe one contrarian stack because Charlie Blackmon and Arenado are good enough hitters that if they're going to be 3% owned or something, in those hitting conditions, they're worth having. But yeah, not on the FanDuel slate, so don't have to worry about them there. Is there anything else to cover? I mean, we are ignoring a few offenses, the Tampa and Detroit games, the Toronto and Minnesota games, the White Sox side of that game, but there are just so many good spots today that I don't think we need to get too carried away with who we're looking at.
Yes, let's wrap this up then. I don't think we have any questions. It's Wednesday afternoon. I think there's people who work on Wednesday afternoons. So go to rotopros.com. You could sign up for a subscription. You can follow me on Twitter at GErenbergDFS. Matt's Twitter handle is at Preaching Sense. We have our podcast, the Foul Balls podcast. We'll be recording for tomorrow's slate later. And Matt is also going to do another one of these pre-lock shows for the late slate.
All right. Thanks for watching, everyone.